Hi everyone and welcome to my Stinger Spiritborn build guide. Lately I had the opportunity to play the Spiritborn early. I've been blasting for like around 100 hours or so, making a lot of builds. I've been also writing a lot of guides for Maxwell, for example, and I've been pumping out some other videos on the Spiritborn. And here is one of my most favorite setups. Stinger really reminds of the good old HAMMERDIN, and you can see this in action here right now. So you have these pestilence swarms that spawn when you press Stinger from two different aspects, and they just kind of float around the screen and they spiral out and then poison everything up, and you get massive poison explosions from the noxious resonance key passive. Overall, this is not necessarily the strongest build, but it's still easily going into Torment 4 difficulty and really close to getting your glyphs to 100 most likely. So I want to show you what this is all about. It's a very fun build. I had a blast with this. And I've prepared a leveling and endgame Maxwell build guide fully written out with all of the details that you can also go check out in the description. I will briefly show them and then explain all of the important details in the planner. In the clip that you are seeing here, I had nearly no ancestral gear. I had no masterworking on my items, so this build can be a lot more powerful than what you are actually seeing. And after the early access was over, I also went back to the kitchen to cook up the best possible setup for Stinger, and here it is. Let's go. So I just want to briefly show those Maxwell guides. So we have the Stinger endgame guide here. This is with all of the details about how everything works, the step priorities. You can look everything up exactly here. Or you can also check out the planner. So we have these different steps here that you can see on the bottom left. These are exactly what is in the build guide here. And there's also, like, for example, more background knowledge about how everything works, about, different items and, these aspects, and whatever you may want to know is all included here. And likewise, if you really want to start with a Stinger, we have the leveling guide here that helps you to get to level 60 in the early game. It is played a little bit differently because we make a few skill adjustments and stuff like that in the early game when we don't have all the aspects available, but I will also show you what this is about. As I mentioned, the star of the show is the Pestilence Swarm. These are these swirling little so-called sub-skills that spawn from Stinger. So every time you attack with the Pestilence aspect, you spawn one of those swarms and they will spiral outwards. They last roughly 3 seconds, and the good thing about them is that they can actually multi-hit a target. Especially when you hit exactly on top of the enemy, you have the spiral starting in a very small pattern, and then it rotates out, and while it is doing that, it can hit a target up to 5 times, even if it's a relatively small target. On larger targets, potentially even more, or when they, for example, follow you around, they can maybe get hit again from the spiral. So this is the main damage in this entire build, and we try to scale those swarms as much as possible, which is also why we have some relatively weird choices for Spiritborn standards in some of our builds. You can't directly buff the pestilence swarms, for example, with some conditional effects like Harmony Helm. Like this is, for example, a helm that's used in many other builds, like it's this one here that says your skills deal 30% increased damage per spirit type they have. This is a very popular helm for Spiritborn builds, but it does not actually function here. So instead, we have to go for raw damage, like generic damage bonuses that are not as specific as something like Harmony here. So in our case, for example, in the late game, we go for Air of Perdition as our helm slot, which is a very powerful helm. And before that, I have a Godslayer crown, which does look weird, but this is the best I could come up with. And honestly, it actually feels really good on a build like this, because as I mentioned, you want to have the enemies stacked on top of your impact location so that you have this multi-hitting ability. And this is actually really important because those pestilence swarms, compared to the Stinger hit itself, will probably contribute roughly 80% of your total damage, or maybe more than that, if you properly, multi-hit and have all the enemies stacked in one pixel. So we try to group them up with Godslayer Crown in the early game, or whenever you get it, basically. You can also do a Vortex on your bar. You don't necessarily need to have something like counterattack in the early game. You can just go Vortex. This is actually what we do in the Pit Push variant, for example. So you just have a more reliable grouping, but we also automate this effect here with one of the runes. So it says here, for example, the Tum rune and the Cry rune, when you cast a core skill, then after I think 12 casts, you'll get a vortex for free. And you can temper a vortex size actually. So we have that here, for example, on the glove, and like this, you automatically pull stuff in, and then you just slam on top of the pack of monsters, and you get all these spiraling swarms that come out of them. So it's a relatively straightforward build as long as you understand that the swarms are your damage. And okay, you can hit them with your stinger, it does a little bit, but it's not really all that relevant. You just try to scale your overall damage output. For example, here as well, we have Ravenous tempered on the weapon. And Ravenous is a passive here on the Spiritborn that gives you extra damage to Centipede skills. Now, the Pestilence Swarms are not directly skills, as I mentioned, but they do benefit from anything that says Centipede. So they do benefit from the Ravenous passive to get extra damage. This also buffs your Stinger damage, but not as much as, for example, another weapon temper, such as Stinger extra hit. So technically, you would think this would be the temper that you would use on a Stinger build. But since this extra hit does not spawn extra swarms, we go with Ravenous, for example. And there's more things like that throughout this build that have these this reasoning behind it. You want to buff the Pestilence Swarms as much as possible. You also pick up stuff like Potent, and you may think, how am I even going to trigger this? You need 100 hits to get to the maximum benefit here on Potent. It's not very easy to do. When you look at this, we don't have, for example, Harmony Helm to get our Jaguar tag on out of our skills. So we have Centipede from the Stinger, and then we have Gorilla from the Gorilla main hall. We don't actually have the Jaguar tag, but we do have the Hunter and we do have a Ravager, and Ravager, every time you hit the enemy, will also produce extra hits, and this will slowly stack this up. And Hunter actually does multiple hits at the same time every time you cast it, so it will ramp slowly. And if a fight lasts a little bit longer, let's say half a minute or so, then Potent actually becomes relatively worth it. The thing about the Stinger build here is it actually has a really good AoE damage output, and the bosses are the main problem on this build. So this is why I actually went for Potent, which is just the strongest passive on the entire tree for Spiritborn, but it's not that easy to stack on this build. But again, if you go for like any kind of boss fights or like higher tiers, or it just helps you with anything that could potentially be difficult, so I threw this in here. But you can also go for some other passives, you know, like more like direct damage and more, just blast for easy stuff. Now, to finish the topic about the Pestilence Swarms, we have also the Infestation aspect here. This is also a really important piece of the puzzle. So it doesn't spawn as many swarms as the Pestilence Swarm, Pestilence aspect, but it does amplify those swarms as well. So all swarms that you ever spawn will have the synergies of both of these aspects. So in this case, we get 100% of the base damage as extra poisoning. And this is actually a really important part, because this is actually a poisoning build that then goes for Noxious Resonance and explodes those poisons on the targets for a lot of extra damage. You can scale this Noxious Resonance key passive with critical strike damage bonus. So in this case, we actually temper crit damage basically on every single offensive slot where we can. So this means our weapon and the rings and the amulets and so on. And this will scale Noxious Resonance. We also use multiple like crit glyphs. For example, there's Fitness that gives a crit damage, and we have the Spirit glyph that gives a crit damage, and we have like a lot of extra synergies here. You see here on the on the character details, we have 3000% crit damage, and this really scales the Noxious Resonance to the moon. So this has a lot of endgame scaling here, because this Noxious Resonance passive just becomes better and better and better. And while the poisons are not directly buffed from crit damage, dots cannot benefit from crit damage directly, you do get more value out of it by stacking crit damage because of Noxious Resonance. And likewise, we also want to get a little bit of crit chance so that we kind of reliably actually trigger those explosions. But since we have so many hits with like the Ravager going on, the Stinger hit, and then also the Pestilence Swarms, it's not very difficult to actually get those explosions. They happen all the time. Lastly, I want to talk about the Ring of Rhythm Moon. You may think, hey, such a HAMMERDIN build with the Pestilence Swarms, probably wants to go for this ring as well. But I tested this and I was not impressed at all. In fact, I think it's actually a downgrade to the build. And the reason why is because it changes the center of the spawn from where you hit the enemy to the character. And this might sound good on paper. You're like, yeah, I can just spawn the swarms and run around and everything just like, gets shredded around me. But the reality actually is that you get way fewer hits, because they already circle around you and not inside of the enemy, where you get like this 4 or 5 hits in a row very quickly whenever they spawn and then spiral out from the enemy. If they start spiraling from you, you're already missing like the first 3 hits, and you hit most enemies only like once or twice. So it's actually just cutting your damage in half when you equip this ring. I do not recommend to go for Rhythm Moon ring. Instead, we actually have some other choices here to solve our resources. So in this case, you can go Midnight Sun ring. It's also featured in many other Spiritborn builds with the Rod of Kapileke, which we are not using here. It's just like a kind of nice early game choice to solve for resources, and you don't have to worry about it. There are other ways to do that. You don't have to go for Midnight Sun ring, but it is fine. So I just threw this in there. And in the late game, you actually want to go for the Stardust Skies, you actually get to the point where you don't really need like a huge extra resource engine, because Starter Skies gives you 50% cost reduction. And then we also have some other benefits, like for example sapping on the paragons. Every time you cast 3 skills in a row with the same tag, you get 15% of your vigor. And then we also have Scourge that we press basically all the time. So while this is going, you also generate a lot of maximum vigor as you go. And we also have Ravager here that gives us extra resource generation. So with all these things together, it is very comfortable to just spam Stinger and not even have Midnight Sun Ring or anything like that. So the Starter Skies is a really huge upgrade in the late game. Then we have a few other aspects here. So there's Redirected Force. This directly scales our crit damage. This works for the sheet crit damage, meaning it works for Noxious Resonance. So this is why it's here. But more importantly, we use Armored Hide as much as possible, which directly gives us 100% extra block chance. And in this case, we have also 1 temper for Armored Hide duration. We just put it here on the pants, for example. And like this, we have relatively comfortable uptime with Jackinth Shell. Now, Jackinth Shell is also really popular, like Spiritborn item. It is extreme cooldown reduction. Basically, everything comes back 4 times as fast. And this means that you have basically everything that you have on your skill bar permanent, including Hunter. You can practice like every few seconds or so. But it does drain your life all the time. So you lose something like 30 to 50% life per second while you have this, while your cooldowns are ticking. And this means you need a lot of healing. Luckily, Stinger actually provides its own healing, so it just comes from the skill, and also Jackinth Shell provides its own healing. So those two things make it very comfortable to kind of keep up your healing and your health, and we also have like 1 point here in nourishment to help with that a little bit. So you're generally gonna keep at full life very easily, and even when you take damage, you will heal it up through that Jackinth Shell drain. So it's not really such a problem. It's only that you have to remember that, you know, for example, after a fight is over, there's nothing you're actually attacking. It still keeps draining until all of the cooldowns are reset. And in that case, for example, we have Auspicious. This is a really nice passive as like a backup. You get a bunch of barriers here while you're not in combat. So this directly negates this downside of the Jackinth Shell. So that's why we went for that. And there's also other barriers. We get Gorilla barriers. And we also have, for example, here the Earthen Bulwark barrier that we get from the rune, from the Care rune. And all of this also synergizes, for example, with the Viscous Shield Paragon node here. So you get a lot of extra damage for having those barriers. So overall, while you think, okay, this drains my life all the time, I don't really like this. First of all, you have a lot of barriers, and second, you have ridiculous healing. So this is not really a big problem here. And as the last unique item, we have the Rakhanov's Wake. So this is an important item here, not because it has such a crazy effect, but because it has a lot of res. It's mostly here for the res, and it has generally nice stats of the movement and the cooldown and so on. But the res is kind of the kicker here, because it kind of caps us out very easily. And then we can go for a lot of skulls and like roll armor on other pieces. And that's important because of unyielding hits. So unyielding hits is the last offensive aspect that we have here, which converts our armor into extra weapon damage. Effectively, you have a stronger weapon. So for example, you have like around 500 damage per attack with your weapon baseline. This is the, you know, base for all further damage calculations. And with unyielding hits, you increase that. So for example, here we have like 4.5k armor, and then 30% of that, we get something like close to 1500 extra weapon damage. So roughly quadruple of what we got here. So this is very powerful damage buff, and it also works for everything you do. I also have some variants here for speed farming and pit pushing. They are very similar to what you got here, so they're based off the mythic variant. And here, for example, when you're farming, you can throw in a soar instead of counterattack. Counterattack is kind of nice for the 100% dodge, but if you're just like one-shotting everything, then you should be totally fine without that. You can get a bit faster speed here. You could even, if you really want, like a throw in like a Shaco for more cooldown or something. If you're like really blasting through everything, like Hell Tides or whatever, you get even more cooldown, even faster. But you have a lot of cooldown reduction, so that's kind of fine. Air of Perdition is quite helpful. And here in pit pushing, this is very similar to the mythic variant as well, but as I mentioned, we have the Vortex here. So we replace the Ravager, which is late game mostly used just for the moving around. Like it dashes with your core skills to the enemies all the time, but in a push, when it's like a slow run, you don't really care much about it. So we go for Vortex, and then we can also change our runes here. So for example, we have the Tal rune that spawns more pestilent swarms. So you want to spawn a lot of them, they do a lot of damage, and in this case, there's also like a good early game choice. It's actually magic runes. So if you find this early on, just throw it in there, and later on you can sort them around. Speaking of early game, I want to go through the leveling a little bit as well. The good thing is that the pestilence aspect is actually unlockable from the codex. So you can actually just go do a dungeon, you get your most important aspect already, but the second most important, the infestation aspect that applies the poison with your pestilence swarms, is actually a drop only. So you want to try to get that and then imprint it as soon as you can, and you have the combo. So in the early game, this looks a little bit different. For example, we have Thunder Spike, and instead of the Hunter, we actually have the Devourer. The Devourer is just like a really badass ability. It's my favorite ability in this entire game now, I would say, or at the very least on the Spiritborn, and I think a lot of people are looking forward to playing with this. Unfortunately, this falls off pretty hard in the late game. I've not really noticed like any way to really make this blast in like Torment 4 or something like that. Maybe you're gonna get more synergies in the future, but in the early game, it actually kind of just like kill stuff on its own. So you summon a Devourer. If you get lucky with some temper recipes, you can also get the Devourer cooldown reduction, for example. You have it like basically permanent with a bunch of tempers, and then you just have this worm following around blasting stuff for you. And you also have to like manage your resources a little bit more. So for example, you use Thunder Spike here. So you Thunder Spike quite a lot. You can also use any other generators. This is not really required, but it's nice for the vulnerable. It's nice for the like evade resets and stuff like that. And we also just try to invest into like extra resources here with Vigorous, Velocity, and then get the Ravager as early as possible. You can actually see the progression through the different steps. So if you're looking for that here in the planner, you can see like, you know, how you unlock the different skills. Or again, in the leveling guide as well, we have like this slider here. So you can like check everything out, and everything is kind of more explained here as well. But the TLDR for leveling is you focus more on the Eagle stuff. For example, you have also the Eagle Primary Hall. This is kind of cool in the early game because you just evade and it shoots these fetters. They make everything vulnerable and they kind of just kill stuff on their own. But they also fall off later if you don't really invest into them. But they kind of carry you from level 15 on for a while. And on the way you'll find some aspects and you will just kind of make the Stinger setup work like that. And that also concludes this guide here. So I hope you have a lot of fun with the Stinger Spiritborn. Otherwise, go check out my other videos and the Max Roll Spiritborn guides that I have either written or reviewed. All of them basically, and there's a lot of really cool stuff on this class. I'm very excited to jump in and blast with all of these builds. That's it for now. Hope you like this, and see you guys next time.